Welcome back, everybody, to XP Game Developers Online, day one of two. If this is your first time joining us, we've got Kate Edwards next, the Executive Director of Global Game Jam, who's going to be presenting Building Better Worlds Through Game Culturalization. With over 30 years of experience in digital media as a geographer and a culturalization strategist, and 27 years in games, you know what? I will show you who I'm talking about instead of just having myself read off a paper. We've got Kate here, who's been involved in the creation of many games, including major titles such as Halo, Fable, Age of Empires, Mass Effect, Call of Duty, and many, many others. She has seen it all when it comes to geopolitical and cultural issues that are often overlooked in content creation and can negatively affect the ability of content to be accepted overseas. And she has pardon me, and she has seen designers miss opportunities to create more robust worlds that engage the players from diverse cultural backgrounds. Kate will discuss the fields of content culturalization and how it can assist game creators with building better game worlds that account for a wider range of cultural and geopolitical considerations. How is that for an introduction?
Nice. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Kate, for joining us. I'll leave the stream to you, and you may take the mic.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you all who are joining to watch this. I hope that wherever you are, that things are going well and that you're safe and you're enduring this as we all are. So game culturalization, what is that all about? Well, basically, as a geographer who has worked in the game industry for 27 years, as of this month, as of April, it's been basically a task that I help game developers avoid making political and cultural mistakes, and also see the opportunities where culture and geopolitics and other factors like that out in the real world might actually help enhance the gameplay experience in some way if it's incorporated into the game design. But let's dive into this. So, a lot of the worlds that we're talking about with games, like things like Skyrim, I mean, it's hyper realistic. It's fully fictional, and yet it's a fully realized world with an incredible amount of detail. Things like Halo, it takes place in our universe, but it happens to be in the far future, several centuries from now. But it also deals with sci-fi themes and fantastic technology that doesn't exist. Games like No Man's Sky, where essentially the world building has all been baked into the code, so it is procedurally generated as you go around and play this game. So basically, all the assumptions about world building and what goes into the design of the cultures and everything else in this game is in the code itself. Even like Grand Theft Auto 5, I mean, this game is an amazing game that is what I would call hyper-real. The world that was built here is obviously very much based on our real world, and yet it's not our world. The city of Los Santos is not the Los Angeles I came from originally, but it is so close to Los Angeles that it might as well be for all purposes. And the team did just an amazing job of replicating the vibe and the feeling of the world of Los Angeles in this fictional way. Even games like Assassin's Creed, every one of those games takes place in real-world locations in hyper detail sometimes, like here in Assassin's Creed 2, taking place in Renaissance Venice, and yet it does have that fictional overlay of a narrative and about the assassins versus Templars and everything else, but it's all happening within the context of the real world in history. Games like Minecraft are all about world building. That's essentially what you do in this game. You're taught about resource management and construction and destruction and all these other things within the world. A lot of times when we talk about world building, a lot of people overlook casual games, or what would be, some people see them as simpler games, but even games like Limbo here, or games like Angry Birds, these all are complex worlds in their own way. They are well thought out. They're well designed. There's actually a narrative involved in both cases. Even in Angry Birds, there's a narrative about birds versus pigs. Maybe in the original game it was not explored that much, but in other media that Rovio has chosen to do, like movies and comics and all that, they've explored that dynamic a bit more. But in the game itself, there is still a world here. It has rules. It has a narrative behind it. It just may not be as complex to the player as it was to the developers who designed it. And we get a lot of our inspiration from sources out there. I mean, a lot of people, when they talk about world building, a lot of people, rightfully so, would point to J.R.R. Tolkien and his work on Middle Earth because he did such an amazing job creating the world. Now, this is the map of Middle Earth that many of us are very familiar with. And when we study this map, we know pretty much everything that happens on this map if we're fans of his work and where the fellowship went and everything else. Now, as a geographer, me looking at this map and the weird configuration of Mordor, for example, with the right-angled mountains and stuff, doesn't make any sense from a geomorphology standpoint. But that's not the point. The point is that he used the map as a tool to convey a sense of reality to the world that he built. Because in our real world, we as human beings respond to maps of our world as basically we see them often as ground truth. We see them as a factual artifact of the world that's out there. And in this much the same way, game creators, people who write science fiction and fantasy and all these other things, they use maps as well to kind of bring a sense of reality to the world that they've built. For example, I mean, almost every single fantasy book since Tolkien includes a map to show some kind of orientation about the fictional world that they've generated. So like the map of Narnia, or this kind of cool Google Maps version of Westeros from Game of Thrones, or Dinotopia, and so on and so on. These maps go. Now, why is it though that the creators of these different worlds, why do they do this? Well, part of it is to give some basic orientation to the world they've created, so you have a sense of what's where, because they rely on it so heavily when they're going through the narrative and talking about where the protagonists are going and what they're actually doing. But another reason why they do something like this is because, in a way, what the author and the creator of the world is trying to tell you is a sense that I was there. I went to this place, I experienced it in great detail, and now I'm writing about it. I'm I'm just happen to be writing a narrative about something that I experienced in this world. So they're in a way, what they're trying to do is bring a sense of real stark reality to the world that they've built in a way that may not be conveyed only through words on a page. And in games, we often do the same thing. We employ different things within our game worlds to bring a sense of reality to them. And that's essentially part of what I want to talk about with culturalization. Now, how does this intersect with games? Well, culturalization essentially at its core is what I'm trying to do is make sure that the games that you and others are creating out there are going to be culturally adaptable to other markets out there. Now, why is it important? Well, it's important because the revenue breakdown of the industry, as such, as you can see from this chart from last year, is that a lot of revenue is made from outside traditional markets. So a lot of game developers I meet, they tend to want to make their games for North America or Western Europe, which is a fine goal because those are still large markets, and yet the place where a tremendous amount of growth is happening is not in traditional markets. So if you look at reports like PricewaterhouseCoopers, who every year has an interactive entertainment report, and they're showing that in some markets, there's ridiculously high double-digit growth year over year, like Nigeria, 22%, India, 15%, Vietnam, 20%. These are emerging markets for technology and for gameplay where a lot of developers, they never think about designing a game for these markets. And yet there's tremendous growth opportunity happening out there. Russia, for example, even though Russia has had tremendous amounts of problems with piracy and things like that, it's still, from a revenue standpoint, has become the 6th largest gaming market in the world, which is vastly significant. And yet I don't find a lot of people creating games for the Russian market, for example. So we have to kind of reset our expectations for exactly who are we making our games for. Are we trying to target like what we consider to be a typical region like North America or Western Europe, or are we actually thinking about all the other kinds of players around the world who might be actually playing our games? Now, what is the difference, though, between localization and culturalization? Because I think most all of us know what localization is. We hear that term a lot. And effectively, that's adapting the content for a local audience, mainly through linguistics. So you're doing a language translation of the content so that it will be linguistically compatible with the different markets. And that is always going to be very important. It has been for decades, and it always will be. But, excuse me, culturalization, though, is actually designing the content for a local market at a deeper level. It's not just about language, it's about user interface, user experience, it's about the character design, it's about the use of history or any other factors that go within the game itself. And will those factors be compatible with the market or not? Now, let me give you an example of the difference between localization and culturalization. So here's a Kit Kat candy bar, and which I think most of us are all familiar with. You can see the top one has a Canadian wrapper in English and French, and the bottom one is in Japanese. And so these are effectively the same product. They're built the same Kit Kat bar, they're a strawberry Kit Kat bar, but they're in a different wrapper with a different language. That's effectively what localization is. So it kind of is a translation of the concept through language. Now in Japan, however, they've taken the Kit Kat bar and made it a completely different experience at a deeper cultural level. So one of the ways they did that is that the name Kit Kat is a play on a Japanese term called kirukatsu, which is kind of this victorious term that you may use in Japan. And so they were lucky enough as a Kit Kat bar, because the name has been around a long time, that they played on that phrase kitukatsu and were able to have a lot of success about that. So that resonated really well with the Japanese market. But the other thing they did is they also employed the Japanese cultural value of collection and the desire to collect things, which is why like games like Pokemon are not a big surprise coming out of Japan, because they are about a collector culture. And in the same way, the Kit Kat candy bars did the same thing, where they regionalize the flavors, so you can get flavors that are available only in certain places around Japan. And they encouraged people, as you can see from this map, to travel around Japan and collect the flavors from different parts of the country. And so with this strategy over the last decade or so, they've actually come up with over 600 different flavors of Kit Kat bars, some based on holidays, some based on location. But this experience only exists in Japan. There's no other country where they've done this kind of level of culturalization of the candy bar. And so basically they took the concept and they made it relevant to the culture in a deep way that doesn't exist somewhere else. And so that's effectively what culturalization can be. Now, there's two types of culturalization I typically have to do when I'm working on a project. One is what I call reactive culturalization, which is effectively identifying things in the experience that might kind of disrupt it for the user. So if they're playing a game and they see something that might be offensive to them or disruptive from their cultural perspective, it's going to stop that experience for them. They're going to kind of be kicked out of the immersion, and it's going to be harder for them to focus on exactly what you would want them to do, which is the gameplay. Now, conversely, I also focus on proactive culturalization, where we're looking for ways to enhance the experience for the player. So, for example, when I worked on Forza Motorsports way back when, we tailored the default car sets to language, so that like in the Italian version of the game, the default cars were mostly Italian cars. Like in the American English version, the default set was mostly like American muscle cars, like Mustangs and Corvettes and things like that. But you could download any kind of car you wanted through DLC, but the default set was basically tailored to what we knew the players in those locations preferred. And so that's a form of proactive culturalization. Now, here's a couple of examples of the difference. So you might recognize this as the Brahmin, which was in Fallout 3, and it wandered through the post-apocalyptic landscape. And so this Brahmin, as you can see, this Brahmin bull is mutated. It has two heads, and it's radioactive. And this is the reason why the game did not sell in India, because in India, the Brahmin bull is sacred to the Hindu faith. And there's actual laws that protect Brahmin bulls from being harmed, at least the real Brahmin bulls. But there was enough legal concern that those laws might be applied to a virtual representation of a Brahmin bull. And so this is the reason why the game did not release in India. Now, what they could have done is do my poorly photoshopped two-headed horse, and that would have been perfectly fine, because the horse is not a sensitive animal. And in fact, you could have used almost anything, but the Brahmin bull, because of its position in the Hindu faith, that's what made this game not release. And unfortunately, the developers at the time felt that it was just not worth the trouble to go through and change it and to swap it out and go through all the testing and rebuilding in order to do that. So it was a lost opportunity. Now, conversely, Marvel, they partnered with a studio in India to create this culturalized version of Spider-Man, as you can see. And the initial reaction was very positive. People thought this is super cool that they would do this. But ultimately, the downfall of this particular version is the fact that you're dealing with a very familiar intellectual property like Spider-Man. Everyone knows it's Peter Parker in New York City. And so what people in India really wanted is they wanted localized versions of the original comics. That's what they would have preferred, because there's like over 100 languages in India. And so a lot of people would have preferred to have a localized version of Peter Parker rather than have an actual culturalized version of the character. So there's a few degrees of culturalization we can look at. So when we're dealing with content and we're trying to release something out into the world, the first level is the reactive culturalization that I just described. The second level is localization and internationalization. So basically doing the translation, and internationalization means using things like Unicode. So you make sure that your software, whatever you're creating, is able to be compatible with all the different language glyphs. And then the third part is proactive culturalization. So if I want to make this simple, basically what you want to do with your content is make it viable, which means you want it to be able to stay in that market. So you don't want anything in there that's going to cause a problem that might get it banned or have people be upset with it. The second part is make it legible to people. And the third part is trying to make it meaningful. And that is a more difficult task, to actually see how can you make your game and the content more meaningful to the players in that specific locale. So essentially what I'm trying to do in the culturalization work is I'm looking at the game worlds that everyone is creating out there, the clients that I work with and others, and seeing, how are these going to be compatible with the local worldviews into which the games are going to be sent. And so this is something like a gene splicing exercise where I'm working in this zone where I'm looking at content elements that are either going to be compatible with the local worldview or they're not going to be compatible. Now, on most of the games I work on, the great majority of content is going to be compatible and it's not a problem. But there are times where there are little things that I might find that will be an issue, and that's when we have to make decisions on what to do about it. Now, the other difference between culturalization and localization is when it actually happens in a typical development cycle. Now, this is a very simplified development cycle, I admit, but you can see my point here, though, is that localization tends to happen later in the product cycle because in order to do the translation, the content has to be complete, which we know content complete tends to be a joke on pretty much any game project, but it needs to be complete enough so that the translators can actually do the work and you don't want them having to do it over and over again. Now, culturalization, however, a lot of the work that I do on a game tends to happen earlier in the process because I sit down with the writers and the producers and the artists at the earliest stages of the game development. So I get an understanding of what is the world they're creating, who's in it, what happens, are there different factions, are there political groups, are there religions, or whatever else might be in this world. So I can understand essentially where the risks might be. So at the early stage, I can make little decisions and advice that can kind of tweak those creative decisions early on, which are super easy to do before you get started, compared to trying to fix something that you find very late in the product cycle. And then as the product gets developed, I do spot checks on the content as it's developed, and they show me what they're making, and I kind of give them advice along the way. So usually by the time we get to the end, there should be no surprises and no big issues that we find. Now, there's multiple considerations, though, when we go through this. It's not just that simple. So first of all, we have to talk about the high-level corporate values and goals. Now, I say corporate, but that can apply to anybody, even a single solo indie developer, because you might have to make decisions in your game content that will reflect on your personal ethics and your personal morality and your values as a human being. And I'm not joking. I mean, that's really kind of how deep it goes sometimes. Because, for example, if a company shows Taiwan in a game as being an independent country, even in a fictional context, that will make the game incompatible with China. They will ban the game. They will not allow the game to be sold. And so you as a company and or as an individual creator, what are you willing to do? Are you willing to change your creative vision just to satisfy China? Or are you going to stick with it and then, face the consequences that you may never sell a game in China? That's a decision that you have to make. And that kind of comes down to your values as a creator. The other thing is the context in which content is generated is also very important, and I'll come back to this point later. But basically, my issue here is that every single one of us has bias, whether we like it or not. And most of us, I think, we work hard to overcome the bias, and that bias is where we're born, where we grew up, or our parents' influence. All of those kind of factors they bias our worldviews. And I'm not saying bias in necessarily a negative way. I'm just facing the reality that every one of us comes from a specific worldview, and that does shape how we create content. Also, for larger companies, they have to think about the business strategy for the vertical, because like for larger companies like Sony and Microsoft, for example, they don't just make games. They make all kinds of other software and hardware. And so games are only one factor to consider in their business model. The other thing is the market strategy for a specific locale. So like, what are we going to do in China versus Korea versus Saudi Arabia and so on? The market strategy also for a specific game, because different game types have different appeals across different markets, so that also factors in. And then finally, the changing geopolitical, cultural, and ethical factors, because we live in a dynamic world, as I think all of us are very much aware, and things do change. So all it takes is, for example, is a regime change in a certain market, and they might have new laws concerning what kind of content you may or may not be able to show. And so we have to be very careful about that kind of thing when we're getting close to release. So, for example, a couple of years ago in Germany, the German ratings board, the USK, decided that Nazi symbology was going to be okay now in games. So you can see here these screenshots from Wolfenstein 2, where the ones on the left are what we saw in the US, but the ones on the right are what they had to show in Germany, because at the time they could not show a swastika. They did not want people to see that character as Hitler. Not that it's that hard to tell without the mustache. But anyway, but basically now they've changed it so you might be able to do this in Germany because the rules are more relaxed. And similarly, I'm sure a lot of us heard last year, we're following the whole drama with Blizzard and their silencing of the Hong Kong protester who won their Hearthstone tournament in Taiwan. That was a whole clusterfund that was really a mess, and I don't have time to go into this. But basically, this was an example of a company not having a strategy for how to deal with this kind of thing. That much was very clear to me. So let's shift a little bit and talk about some of the core aspects of world building from like the very highest level. So let's talk about context, complexity, and structure, just to get started with this. So the context, I kind of alluded to this earlier in some of my examples, but one of the things we have to think about when you're creating a game, does it take place in the real world, or does it take place in a completely fictional world? Or, as with a lot of games, is it somewhere in between? Is it, like I mentioned, Grand Theft Auto 5 is very close to the real world, but it's not the real world. It's what I call hyper-real. So it's almost real, but not quite. Whereas other things like the Skyrim example, completely fictional, they have nothing to do with our world and our universe. This does make a difference in terms of how a lot of decisions that will get made as far as culturalization, as you'll see later in some of my examples. And of course, another axis on here, which I have not shown, is time as well, because you could have a real world game that takes place in the far future, like Halo, or something that's in the distant, or more distant past, like Assassin's Creed. The other thing I want to point out, too, is the term realization versus realism. So I think a lot of people will talk about the word realism, and that to me means basically photorealism and how I'm sorry, my cat is meowing here. He wants to join in on the conversation. Realism is effectively, basically, does it look photorealistic or not? That's not what I'm talking about when I talk about realization of a world. Realization actually is how much world do you need to create? And what I mean by that is effectively you have narrative goals for your game and you have experience goals. So basically what happens in the game and what does the player actually do in the game? What is the player experience in that game? At its very fundamental level, these two levels, the narrative goals and the experience goals, are what are defining the realization goals for your world. So this, at its very core, helps you understand how much world you actually need to build. And so a lot of times, I when I work with developers, I constantly keep encouraging them to go back to the original intent of the narrative and the player experience and focus on that in terms of deciding what actually needs to be created to build out the world. Now, some of the structural tools that we use for realizing worlds, I want to talk about those. So one is about cultural evidence. Another is logical consistency. Also, how we imply complex systems in the world, and also establishing some basis of familiarity by using thematic layers. And yes, I'm going to describe all of these, so don't worry. So building cultural evidence is essentially when you're in the state of creating the world, it's about how much content do we actually make to make out the environments, to fulfill those narrative and experience goals. And a lot of times what I've seen in all the game projects I've worked on is that this is the highest risk activity, because this is when like the artists and the writers and everyone are kind of set loose after that initial concept phase, and everyone's just heads down creating and doing what they do best and exercising their amazing skills. But oftentimes they're creating stuff that may or may not be always necessary for the environment, or it may not even be compatible with the intent of the environment. And so two key tips I have for this phase when we're creating things to fill out the environment is you can't be lazy about it. You always have to create with a purpose. You always have to make sure that whatever you're creating has an intent behind it. And the other part is somebody at some point has to ask those hard, challenging questions about something that was created. And a lot of times I tend to be the person who asks those challenging questions because I get hired to ask those challenging questions. And sometimes creative folks will take it as an offensive remark that I'm questioning their creative ability. That's not what it is. I love their creative ability. What it is kind of help them understand what they just created and kind of to help them reflect back on what those initial realization goals are. And like, did they create something just now that is a reflection of those goals, or is it not? And that's basically part of the kind of Jiminy Cricket conscience role that I sometimes have to play. Here's an example. So when I worked on Jade Empire way back when, this takes place in a completely fictional universe of a kind of this pan-Asian universe, but it's completely fantasy world. It doesn't have anything to do with with this world. And so in this one environment, you could see here this hallway where there were these glowing blue cylinders. Well, originally what they looked like were, these. These are prayer wheels from Tibetan Buddhism. And so this is what was originally in the hallway in that artwork. And so this is one of those cases where, because the mandate of the game was that it was supposed to be this Asian environment or Asian inspired environment, the artist just started throwing Asian artifacts into the environment, some of which made sense, but some of which, like these, did not make sense because they had no role in this particular game. There was no reason for them to be there. So this is something that was found late in the process. So rather than remove them entirely, you can see here they were basically reskinned to be like these glowing blue energy cylinders. Now, logical consistency is another important concept because this is where a lot of players kind of get their sense of realism from. Realism meaning, does this game feel like it takes place in a reasonably realistic environment? And again, I'm not saying it's photorealistic necessarily, but it's like even within Tolkien's world, for example, he had rules that were established. Like the physics of his world were similar to the physics of our world, and things kind of worked the same way. So we as human beings relate to that because there's a sense of logical consistency. So that this is a concept that is used in geography quite a bit, where we are looking at spatial data sets, for example, and trying to see if all the data in that set is logically consistent. So we don't want to find a contradiction between the narrative intent of the world and the content that gets put into it. So here's an example. Maybe this will help make it clearer. So this is from the game Cameo that I worked on way back when. And you can see here on the side of this road are some wooden crosses. Now, these wooden crosses were intended to be grave markers on the side of the road. And so remember, though, that this universe is completely fictional and it has nothing to do with our universe whatsoever. So why would there be a Christian cross on the side of the road to mark a grave? And so I posed that question to the artist at the time, and the answer I got back was, what else would I use? Well, that's the problem. It's like your job as a creative artist is to actually create. So maybe you can think about, what would a grave marker look like in this universe? Because it's not going to be a wooden cross, probably. And so my point, though, is that this object, this cultural artifact, is not logically consistent with this world. It doesn't really make sense to be there. And so it kind of it's one of those things that can kind of throw a player out of the experience and have them wondering, well, wait a minute, where exactly am I supposed to be? Because I recognize that symbol, and yet I'm not supposed to, because this is supposed to be a fantasy world. Another really powerful concept that we use for realizing world is the idea of topology. Now, this is also a concept that comes from geography. And what it is, it's not topography, which is about elevation and distance and things like that. It's topology, which is about the relationship between two things. So it's basically the how and why things are related, and not the distance or the where and all that kind of thing. So, for example, right now, there's a topological relationship between you and I. I'm the speaker and you're an audience. And so that is a topological relationship that currently exists. And so in games, we can use that concept to basically build out a world and imply larger worlds and imply ideas and concepts without actually having to create or fully explain the full depth or breadth of that concept. And this is one of the powers of using something like topology. So it can convey a sense of a much bigger universe without actually building it. And so here's an example. So when I worked on the original Halo games, one of the things I thought was brilliant in these games, and I'm sure you're familiar with them, they're first-person shooters, very linear gameplay where you're basically following pretty much a linear path, shooting things and trying to advance on the goals of that particular level. Now, if you took the time to actually look around the environment a bit after after killing what needs to be killed, they in different parts around the Halo ring, as you're exploring it, there are these things called the terminals. And if you interact with the terminals, you actually get a little pop-up, and it has some text you can read that actually builds out information about the universe that you're in. So as you're running around on this amazing Halo ring that was built by these people called the Forerunners, and you can see the interesting Forerunner architecture everywhere, but you don't really know much about it. And so in order to kind of fill that gap a little bit for the player, they built these terminals. So when you interact with the terminal, you get to learn a little more information about exactly what's the backstory behind this Halo ring and behind what happened here. And it's a really brilliant way of actually adding a lot of depth to your game without actually having to create very much on the back end. They didn't create a whole nother level. They didn't create a whole bunch of other characters. All they did was have a text pop-up which you could read through, and that terminal made sense in the context of the game. So it was a really nice way to handle that. Now, in terms of thematic layers and how we build a sense of familiarity, well, this is one of the areas where geographers really can be useful. We tend to be well suited for world realization because, frankly, we spend most of our time deconstructing the real world out there around us. So whenever you see a map is essentially a reconstruction of the world. So cartography is really about world rebuilding. So we select things out in the real world to decide which objects out there in the world we're going to represent on a map and kind of rebuild the world, and we do it for a specific purpose, and we're very selective about what we decide to show because we obviously can't show everything on a map. And so we use geographic information systems which organize the data into layers, as you can see here in this chart. And those, we use the GIS to analyze, phenomenon between layers. That's how we determine certain things are happening. Like right now, during the pandemic, we're using GIS to analyze, the spread of disease and the spread of a virus versus different factors in the population or different factors in the transportation networks. So this can be really useful. So when you're building a world, for example, and you're thinking about your realization goals, you can think about all the different kinds of layers you could potentially build into your game world. And this is a very simplified list. If I wanted to make this a detailed list, it could go like all the way to the center of the earth with the amount of detail and the amount of specific layers. But let's look at just a couple of examples here, like climatology. So does your game need a weather system? Even if it's a fantasy world or whatever, does it need a weather system? Well, I've worked on some game projects where they spent a tremendous amount of time building a weather system, but it really didn't have any effect on the gameplay. It was there for mostly for aesthetics, but it was far more complicated than it needed to be. And so they kind of overbuilt, which is oftentimes one of the biggest problems I see, which kind of goes back to my point about cultural evidence, is I see a lot of developers overbuild. They lose focus of those realization goals, and so they just start making all kinds of stuff because, they think it's cool, which is, on one level that's fine, but do you really need to do it? Whereas you look at a game like Breath of the Wild, and the climate system in the game has a direct impact on the gameplay in many different ways. Like you can't climb very well if it's raining because it's slippery, or if you're out during a thunderstorm, the lightning's going to hit you, and if you're up in the mountains, you get cold and things like that. And so it has a direct impact on the gameplay, and so it makes a lot of sense to have a climatological model in a game like Breath of the Wild. And so, again, there's all these different layers that you could choose to employ in your game depending on what your needs are. But again, you have to constantly remind yourself, what are my realization goals? And so my encouragement is to start only with the things that are most fundamental to serving those realization goals. And start only with those, and don't focus on all the other cool bells and whistles until you have those things completely done, or at least well solidified on their way to development. And then you can start thinking about other things that you might want to add that might enhance the experience for the player. Now, what I want to focus some time on and show you some examples are some of the most problematic layers that I've had to deal with, and some of the most problematic issues with different themes that I've seen in video games. So a lot of these are going to be, I think, pretty self-explanatory, but I will go into each one of these with examples. So like history, the use of faith, the issue of inclusion versus exclusion, intercultural dissonance, which I will explain, and geopolitical imaginations of governments. So first of all, let's talk about history. Well, history, we've had a lot of games out there that deal with real-world history. I've worked on all the Age of Empires games. I've worked on Rise of Nations. I'm a huge fan of Civilization, all these kinds of games. But it could also include games like Call of Duty or Assassin's Creed and all that kind of stuff that also deal with real history. We have to remember that in a lot of markets out there, history is a very sensitive subject, and not everyone sees history the same way. As it's not a universal perception of what actually happened in the past. So as an example of that, when I worked on the original Age of Empires, this was way back in 1997. So one of the scenarios that was in the original game was this scenario in which the Japanese, there in the blue on the right, they invaded the Korean Peninsula, this happened during the Middle Ages. So this is with the Chojin Empire in Korea. So basically the Japanese invaded the Korean Peninsula and basically almost took over the Chojin Empire. And this is what history tells us really happened in that case. And so they decided to put this into the game because it would be a very challenging scenario for players. You're playing as the Chojin and you're trying to, stop this huge invasion of Japanese. And so, pardon me. So the game was released, and right as it was released, the Korean Ministry of Information, pardon me, they said that this never happened. So now what are we supposed to do? So they said that this scenario didn't happen, not in this way, and so therefore the game is not going to be released because it's not accurate. And so we had to step back and we had to think about this. So remember that slide I showed about multiple considerations? So first of all, you're dealing with Microsoft, and it's at a time when they're trying to grow their games business in a really big way. And so growing the games business was super important. They also knew from market research that this game, Age of Empires, was very popular in other locales. So the game itself had a lot of value, and we know that from history that it did. We also knew from market research that South Korea is a huge game-playing population, as I think most people know. And we also knew that real-time strategy games like Age of Empires were super popular in Korea. So basically, the bottom line from a business perspective was that we'd have to release this game. So what are we supposed to do? Well, eventually what happened is that we decided to do a patch only for the Korean market that shows, as you can see here, it shows the Koreans invading Japan instead. And no, that is not historically accurate. And so, as you can imagine, on the development team, it created something of a debate about the nature of truth and ethics. Is this ethical to do, to change history? Well, first of all, let's think about Age of Empires. It is a great historical game, but it's not completely accurate. There's a lot of liberties taken with the history in order to serve the purpose of the gameplay and to make the scenario playable. There's also things that happen in some of the tech trees of some of the cultures, like the Aztecs, having advanced units that they probably never had, things like of that nature. The other thing I had to remind the team of, though, is that a few years earlier, when I worked on Encarta Encyclopedia at Microsoft, we had different facts in different versions of the encyclopedia. So, for example, in the French and Italian versions of the encyclopedia, there were different heights for the mountain Mont Blanc, because at the time the governments did not agree on the height of the mountain, and the height was only off by like a few centimeters, but they didn't agree. And because the encyclopedia is an educational resource, we had to conform to local educational regulations. And so we had to change the facts according to the different markets. So in a way, we were already doing that practice and serving up the local expectation. And so this example in Age of Empires, we were basically doing the same thing for the Korean market. Now, was it the right decision? Well, considering how successful the Age of Empires franchise has been, and considering the fact that 1 year later, StarCraft released, which is an RTS game, and that became a national phenomenon in Korea and still remains one to this day. So it was probably a wise decision to go ahead from a business perspective and do this, but we had to be very careful and think very carefully through our decision-making process. Now, faith is another issue we have to think about, because a lot of cultures out there to which we send our games have their expectations based on their religious beliefs. So, for example, these two games both got in trouble because they contain an audio file that had lyrics and or chanting from the Islamic Quran, neither of which would be that's really not appropriate to put in either of these video games. And so I don't have time to go into the great detail of both of these stories, especially the game on the left, Kakuto Chojin, which I worked on. But effectively, I can tell you that because nobody checked this one audio file and tried to understand what the lyrics were, which happened to be from the Quran, that led to this game being globally recalled after a few months on the market because the backlash was so severe. And so you have to think about it. Is the whole success of a single game worth hinging on the fact that somebody did not check the lyrics of one audio file? So you have to think about this stuff very carefully. So if you're using source music or source, files or content or anything, you have to be really careful about where you're getting it from and to double check what it actually means. Also using religious sites, like in Resistance Fall of Man, they used the Manchester Cathedral in the UK, and the Church of England was not amused because they actually destroyed most of the church during the gameplay, and so the Church of England was not consulted on this before the game came out, and eventually they were able to come to some kind of agreement, but as a result of this, the Church of England now has what they call sacred digital guidelines, which means you can't show any Church of England facility in a game or anything else unless you get their approval. And I can guarantee you, basically, if you're going to destroy it somehow like they did here, they probably will not give you approval. In Hitman 2, they sort of did the same thing, where they took the fighting of the gameplay into the most holy site of the Sikhs in Amritsar, India, the Golden Temple. And within the temple, you can see here the main characters killing Sikhs at their most holiest site, and that was considered really problematic and offensive. So they got a lot of backlash for that as well. And they probably, they could have done it outside the temple or somewhere near it, but doing it actually in the temple itself is pretty sacrilegious. Or games like Smite, what they did is they took the pantheon of Hindu gods, which are worshipped by about over 1 billion people, and they equated those with the gods of ancient Norse and ancient Egyptians, which are not really worshipped by many people at all these days. And so they kind of made that equivalence in terms of the religion. And so a lot of people of the Hindu faith got upset because they saw these gods whom they worship and admire being used in a video game in a way that they felt was really inappropriate. And so that's an example where the developer probably could have shown a bit more sensitivity before they decided to leverage that particular pantheon of gods. Now, inclusion and exclusion is basically where something in a game will cause the perception of inequitable treatment on the basis of someone's gender or culture or nationality or ethnicity or some other factor. And so this is one of those areas which it becomes a broad category that we have to be careful about. And I'll show you a couple examples. So in Resident Evil 5, when this game was coming out, they released these images showing this Caucasian male shooting these African villagers in sub-Saharan Africa, and they're the contrast was very stark, and a lot of people got very upset because the racial implications of what you're showing here are pretty stark. And now originally the company's response was, as you can see from the image on the right, is they said, well, what's the big deal? They're just zombies, so we don't see the problem. Well, it is a problem because this does harken back to imagery of the Dark Continent and the Great White Hunter and all these really antiquated negative ideas from over 100 years ago that we've completely rejected at this point. But this brings up my point about the context in which content is created. This game was created in Japan, where it's 98% ethnic Japanese, and you don't have the same kind of concept of diversity that you have perhaps in the West. And even back in my days working at Microsoft, there was a time where I actually had to go to Microsoft Japan and gave lectures about diversity, because at the time, back in the 90s, that's when diversity was becoming more and more of a prevalent issue in corporate America. And so we wanted to make sure that all of our subsidiaries understood what the concept meant. And so basically, this is an example where the bias that exists because you're coming from a specific culture or a specific worldview influences the content and what you created. Now, could they have found out and done the research? Yes, they could have, and they should have done the research to understand that this particular imagery is really negative. And so in hindsight, that they've learned a lot because of what happened with this incident. But this is a case where they could have done more research and actually avoided this problem at that point. But we also have to remind ourselves that, do you even have the mindset to ask that question in the first place? And that's basically what I'm getting at. In some cases, that the question won't even come up. Also with games like Pocket Gods, you can see here where they have this little island with these indigenous people. Where the one problem is that the indigenous people are portrayed in a very antiquated way with pointy sharp teeth and bones in their hair and grass skirts, kind of this antiquated idea of what indigenous people are. So that's problem number one. The other problem is that the point of this game is you torture these people and you feed them to sharks and you have ants eat them and you have the volcano explode and melt them. And that's basically the whole point of this game. And so they got a lot of backlash from Polynesian people when this game came out. And the developer was like, we don't understand. This is like a completely fictional little island. Is it, though? Well, you can see there on the right side of the island, there is a stone head, which is a moai. And the moai exists only on one place on Earth, which is Easter Island. So the fact that they use that cultural artifact, that's the moai, they instantly made this a specific culture. And therefore, I would say that people from that background should feel like they are being picked on because it is their culture. And so you can see in later versions of the game, they actually swapped out that stone head for something that they created randomly, so they didn't make that association anymore. Intercultural dissonance deals with a broader category where cultures may have problems or tension between each other for a lot of different issues. And this also gets to a broader category, which sometimes can be really hard to predict. So here's an example again from Korea in Age of Empires. I'm not picking on either. It just happens to be a really good example. So this box art was refused in Korea because of the Japanese samurai being on the box. Now, the key issue behind this, it's not because the game itself was a problem. It's not really because of the box art itself. It's just because of the Japanese samurai appearing when this game came out way back when. And so this game, the problem was that this game came out at a time when Japan and Korea were at a height of tension over a geopolitical dispute in the middle of the Sea of Japan. There's these little rocks. They're called Dokdo in Korean. They're called Takashima in Japanese. And so during that height of tension between the two countries, like Korean retailers, for example, they did not want to put anything Japanese related on their shelf. Well, here comes this game with a samurai on the box, and they're like, we don't want this on our shelf. We're not going to sell anything that has to do with Japan. And so, unfortunately, the game was kind of caught in the crossfire of a real geopolitical dispute that was happening out there in the real world, and it really had nothing to do with the game itself. It just happened to be an unfortunate use of box art. So when this game, when the expansion pack to this game came out several months later, most of the world saw the version on the top right with Montezuma on it. But then in Korea, we did a special version showing a Korean general, which was kind of a way to make up for the samurai mistake. But this happens every once in a while. Just a few years ago, this happened in China, where there's a geopolitical dispute between China and Japan called the Senkaku Islands in Japanese, or the Diaoyu Islands in Chinese. And the Chinese consumers were really upset at the heightened tension with Japan and China, or with Japan, over this issue at the time. And so during 1 month, Japanese goods like from Sony, Toyota, Honda, and all these other Japanese companies, they dropped at least 50% in sales in 1 month because Chinese consumers were basically protesting against Japan over the geopolitical dispute. So this stuff does happen from time to time. Another area of dissonance is the use of gestures. So gestures are highly culturally specific, and so this is a minefield to use gestures in all kinds of ways. I worked on all the Dance Central games where they're looking at gestures that are being used during the dances. So you can see here the character who's doing that motion on the left, which is not too different from what's called the bras d'honneur, which is basically the same as the middle finger. On the right, she's using what is typically seen as the rock-on gesture. So in rock and roll circles, it's that's very common. But in places like Italy, it means I'm sleeping with your wife, or that you're a cuckold. It has a very, very different meaning. And so, we have to be very conscious of the fact that these gestures that we human beings use are very specific to different cultures, and we have to be careful about how we use them. For example, I gave a lecture at Facebook headquarters a few years ago in which I pointed out to them that this like gesture is basically the same as this in different cultures, but it's too late because now that's the corporate symbol of Facebook. And lastly, geopolitical imagination. So this tends to be focused on maps, and a lot of governments, they like to reinforce what they believe they own in terms of territory, their national sovereignty, and they use maps to do it. And so you can see here in the game Hearts of Iron, both of these games were banned in China because Tibet and Taiwan were not being shown as Chinese territory. Now, the interesting thing is that this map, as you can see, China's divided up into many different territories because this game is basically like Risk, like the board game Risk. You're trying to take over the world in different pieces. But they specifically were upset that Tibet and Taiwan were not being shown as the same color and not being integrated into China. And so they banned the games. What's interesting is that these games take place during World War II. The People's Republic of China did not come into existence until 1949, 4 years after World War II. And so, basically the Chinese government in this example is reinforcing their sovereignty over territory before they technically even existed. So that's an interesting thing that the Chinese game reviewers will do, similarly to how they are currently building fake islands down in the South China Sea to reinforce their sovereignty, but that's a whole nother topic. Even simple things like this in a options screen. When I worked on Ninja Gaiden, you can see here where it says country select. It says ROC, which means Republic of China, and it has the Taiwan flag. Well, Republic of China is the alternate name for Taiwan, which is used by a lot of people who want Taiwan to be an independent country. And so to this line right here is a highly charged political statement, because you're saying the Republic of China, which is a term that's banned in China, is a country, and here's its flag, which is the flag is also banned in China. So to show this statement in your game, even if it's on a selection screen like this, will get you instantly banned in China. But there's a quick fix to this, as you'll see. So if you watch carefully, what we do is we take the flag out because it's redundant information and you don't need it there. We use the name Taiwan because that name is acceptable to both sides, both in Taiwan and in China. And we say country/region. And so basically you defer the perception to the user. Is Taiwan a country or is it a region? Well, it depends basically on where you're sitting. And that's not for you, the developer, to decide. If you let the user, basically choose the perception, that kind of gets you out of the problem of having to assert what it might be. And so that's a simple fix for this kind of issue. And then, I've worked on a lot of stuff outside of the game industry that deals with maps. For example, I helped Google with what we call domain tailoring. And so you see this all the time, where basically the map looks differently depending on where you're looking at it from. Because like in the disputed Kashmir region in northern India, by law, you must show it as Indian territory in India. So the map on the right, you have to show it that way, or else your product will be banned instantly. It doesn't matter if it's a map or a game or something else, but you have to comply with local law. So if you're going to make a game set in the real world and it's going to have a real map in it, you have to be very careful about who's going to be looking at your map and what versions of the map you're showing in which different locales. So finally, as I'm wrapping up here, I have a few concluding things to talk about. So first of all, let's talk about the target audience. So I at its most basic level, I see two different levels. We've got the intended audience, which are basically people who play games, and they understand games, and they enjoy games. So, basically these people only care if the game sucks or not. They're not really focused on the issues that I just described. All they really care about is if it's a fun game to play. The unintended audience are the people who don't play games, and they tend to take things out of context because they're not familiar with games. And so at its basic level, the proactive culturalization is done to enhance the experience for the intended audience, and the reactive work is done for the unintended audience who, basically might have a knee-jerk reaction and call for bans and all that other kind of stuff. And also, when we are distributing our games today in the content cloud, we have to remind ourselves that it's going to be instant, it's going to be to a broad multicultural audience, that there is a huge community out there that is going to either react very positively to what we do, but if we make a mistake, especially with something like a cultural issue, we are going to hear about it, and it's going to be a potentially huge backlash. And so we want to try and get it right before our content goes out there. And the other thing we have to think about is the issue of mind share. So why I have often given a big focus on governments and making governments happy. Well, why is that? Well, it's because they often control the distribution. They're the ones who have the game rating boards. They're the ones who decide whether or not your game is going to be allowed or not. But the other issue here at play is that governments and cultural institutions are fighting for mind share to decide who gets to influence the local populace. And so that's why the Great Firewall of China exists. And that's why Russia implemented their sovereign internet law last year, because they're trying to shelter their citizens from external influence, which is not necessarily a good thing. But it's one of those factors that we're dealing with. And then finally, just to conclude, is the point about freedom of creativity. I feel very strongly that you need to exercise your creative vision no matter what it is. But you just have to remember that that vision won't always align with other cultures. So you have to be extremely conscious of the creative decisions you're making during the world building process, and just be mindful of the fact that everything you're doing may or may not be compatible. But that's okay, because you can make the decision that you're going to stick with your creative vision and have artistic freedom. Or if you want to maximize your revenue, you're going to have to do more changes and more modifications to your content to make sure that it's compatible with as many places around the world as possible. This is what I call the fulcrum of compromise. And basically every game developer out there who's trying to make a living at games sits on this fulcrum of compromise and tries to make that decision when we're making a game. So there you go. I think I may have gone over. I just hit my time limit. I'm not sure, but if we don't have time for questions, I'm more than happy to have questions if you want to send them to me. Thank you.